Welcome to the Law Building at 14 Vesey Street, across from St. Paul's. This is the way it looks today, and it hasn't changed very much in the last 80 years. Let us look at the front for a moment. We do see one thing that has changed in the last 80 years. I don't know when, and I don't know why, but back in the 1930s, the flagpole was located up here. Apparently, people raised the flag from the boardroom itself. That's not where the flagpole is today. The flagpole is now down 2 floors, just over the main entrance door. I don't know when, and I don't know why it was moved. There are 2 other changes in the front, that fire hydrant and the lamp post. I don't think they add very much. And now we go to the beginning, 1908. This was Nikolas' first home, the City Investing Building at Broadway and Cortlandt Street. We're looking from the north. Broadway is to the east, our left. Church Street is to the west, our right. Here we see the north side of the building, which is the south side of Cortlandt Street, just across from today's Century 21 store. You see a small building in the lower left-hand corner. That is the southwest corner of Cortlandt and Broadway. That is not part of the City Investing Building. The City Investing Building's fronting on Broadway was only about 37.5 feet. Not much, but it qualified the City Investing Building for the high rent address of 165 Broadway. Now that picture was deceptive. It looked as if it were the tallest building around, but of course it wasn't. Now we'll see what the building actually looked like. Here you see what stood on the south half of the block with the City Investing Building. It's the Singer Building. It was the tallest building in town when it was completed in 1908. Although not as tall, the City Investing Building had the largest number of square feet, 500,000. Now to orient ourselves, here's the Singer Building and the City Investing Building, and here is Broadway headed to the south. Now we look at where these 2 buildings were on Broadway. Here's a map of Lower Manhattan from 1916. We'll come back to it for reference as we look at other downtown buildings that no longer exist. As you see, at the bottom is Battery Park, and at the north or top is City Hall Park. East is to our right, and west is to our left. We'll come back to this later. Now we'll zoom in to the Singer and the City Investing Buildings. Here's the block west of Broadway, between Liberty Street and Cortlandt Street, and between Broadway and Church Street. Now, let's take a few more looks at Nikolas' first quarters. Here's the Broadway side. Over here is that little entrance on Broadway for the City Investing Building. Now, let's look at the skyline from the Hudson. The Singer Building and the City Investing Building distinctively stand out in this picture. This image is from some time between 1908 and 1911. This view looks down Broadway from Chambers Street. The Singer Building and the City Investing Building are distinctive. Over to the lower left is a building not quite so tall. That was the old post office building that housed the federal courts. We'll come back to it later. This is the view looking south along Church Street. We're looking from Fulton or Vesey Look into Church Street and you'll see the 6th Avenue Elevated Railway. Here is another look at these buildings. Again, the Singer Building and the City Investing Building. And you see a larger building to the right, that is to the west. That is the Hudson Terminal Building. It was the transportation hub for this part of downtown. Each floor was about 70,000 square feet, and the building stretched from Cortlandt Street 2 blocks north to Fulton Street, and it went west from Church Street all the way to Greenwich Street. The basement levels of the building housed the terminal station for the Hudson Tubes. They were completed in 1908 and connected Manhattan with New Jersey. Above ground, there was an elevated railway on Church Street, the 6th Avenue L, and another elevated railway on Greenwich Street, the 9th Avenue L. Now, let's return to our map and better see where this building fits into Lower Manhattan. Here is the terminal building between Fulton Street and Cortlandt Street, and between Church Street and then Greenwich. Here is the Hudson Tube Loop under the building. The 2 elevated trains on either side running north and south. Here is an artist's rendition. It is massive. Above street level there were 2 separate buildings, Day Street between them. 2 tenant bridges connected the upper floors. Here is a photograph of the Hudson Terminal Building. We are at the edge of the Hudson River to the southwest, and we're facing northeast. The southern face of the building is to our right, that is Cortlandt Street, and the Greenwich Street facing of the building is to our left. Here is the top of the space where Day Street cuts through the complex. Now, let's follow it to ground level at the corner of Day Street and Greenwich Street. Look at what is at Greenwich Street, the 9th Avenue L. Remember, on the other side of the building is the 6th Avenue L to the east of the building. Now, let's take a look at the east side of the building. We are on Vesey Street between Church and Broadway, approximately where 20 Vesey Street is today. Here's the gap at Day Street. This is Church Street. This is Fulton Street. This is St. Paul's Churchyard along Fulton. This is where Century 21 is today. This is where the Millennium Hotel is today, just east of Church Street between Fulton and Day. This is the 6th Avenue Elevated. But here's something different. This building no longer exists. A century ago, there was a narrow building facing Church Street with its back to St. Paul's graveyard. It is no longer there. Now, we'll leave our vantage point near Church Street, cross to the other side of Broadway, and look back at these buildings from the northeast. Here is a view from the Hudson, and a view of the skyline itself. The Singer Building, the City Investing Building, the Hudson Terminal Building, all gone, demolished. The Hudson Terminal Building was demolished when the World Trade Center was constructed. One Liberty Plaza now stands where the Singer Building and the City Investing Building were. They were both demolished in the late 1960s. After they were demolished, the Singer Building at 41 stories had the distinction of being the tallest building ever demolished. It held that record until September 11, 2001. We dwell on these 3 or 4 blocks for 2 reasons. They were NYCLA's neighbors in 1908, and they embody the urban excitement of that time. Hundreds of thousands of square feet of commercial real estate space, opening within a year and within 3 blocks. 2 elevated trains, One underground train, indeed underwater train, came together at the corner of Church and Cortlandt. Imagine standing there a century ago. Movement, noise, voices, above ground, underground, to the front, to the back. The stuff that starts the juices flowing. In the midst of that, the New York County Lawyers came into being. One of the first tall buildings downtown was the Equitable Building at 120 Broadway. It was 6 stories tall when it opened after the Civil War. Its upper floors housed the Lawyers Club with a large library and dining facilities. Here is a picture of a power lunch at the Lawyers Club. It honored Glenn Curtiss, the aircraft pioneer. The picture was taken in 1909. In January 1912, fire destroyed the club, the library, and the Equitable Building. A half-dozen firefighters perished in that blaze as icy temperatures froze. 3 years later, Equitable rebuilt on the same site, 120 Broadway, and that building is still standing. It enclosed the largest commercial office space in the world, more than 1,800,000 square feet. It held that record until 1931, when the Empire State Building opened. This bulky place generated much controversy because it was not set back from the sidewalks, and its upper floors were not terraced in a wedding cake fashion. Critics complained that buildings like it blot out the light and air of its neighbors. In 1916, zoning legislation limited Manhattan building heights without appropriate setbacks. Across the street at 111 and 115 Broadway are 2 landmark structures built between 1906 and 1907. The Trinity Building on the north side of Trinity Churchyard is a Gothic Revival slab that serves as a sort of backdrop to the church's own Gothic style. Architect Francis Kimball designed it and its northern neighbor, the U.S. Realty Building, as a single project that covered Old Temple Street south from Cedar and moved Thames Street to the north so that it acts as an air shaft between the 2 structures. Kimball's neo-Gothic motif continues to the north side of the U.S. Realty Building, which faces modern Zuccotti Park. Here we see some of those Gothic details. Each of these buildings has a 68-foot front on Broadway and rises to a height of about 200 feet. Both stretch from Broadway for about 260 feet to Trinity Place. Erected before the 1916 zoning law, these buildings' sheer exterior walls offer no light to brighten the bottom of Thames Street. They were a couple of blocks south of NYCLA's headquarters at the City Investing Building, which was also designed by their architect, Francis Kimball. This is an image of what was just north of Broadway and Fulton Street 100 years ago. St. Paul's Chapel is easy to recognize. The other places are less familiar to us, so we'll look at the map. Here on the map is the area north of Broadway and Fulton. You'll see some features, and then we'll look at the images themselves. Here was the St. Paul's Building at the corner of Ann Street and Broadway. This was the Park Row, or Ivins Building, located on Park Row. It was syndicated by William Ivins, one of NYCLA's founders. Here is Park Row itself. The old post office was here. Behind the post office was a street called Mayle Street. It no longer exists. On the west side of Broadway there was a hotel, the Astor House. It was demolished in 1913. And south of Vesey Street was St. Paul's, which we can recognize because it's still standing. We go back to Broadway, Vesey Street, and Park Row and identify the St. Paul's building, the Ivins building or Park Row building, the post office, Astor House, and of course St. Paul's. Over here along Vesey Street is where Nykla's current building is at number 14. We are now looking at the southeast corner of Broadway and Ann Street. This building is the St. Paul's building. It was generally considered to be the ugliest skyscraper in Manhattan. It was finished in 1898, the same year as the Ivins building. It was 26 stories high, and it was demolished in 1958. If you look at the facade, you can perhaps understand why people thought it was so ugly. At street level, the building sat catty-cornered on Ann Street and Broadway. Above the entrance, there was a repeating motif of 2 stories, 2 stories, 2 stories, over and over until we get to the top. People thought that repeating theme was boring. As we move a few feet north along Broadway and move up Park Row, we see the Ivins Syndicate building, also called the Park Row building. It was finished in 1898. It was the tallest building in New York until the Singer Tower was completed in 1908. The Ivins building is where J&R is located today. The top of the Park Row building has those distinctive towers with lanterns at the upper level. Just over the entranceway are four sculptures, or 2 pair of caryatids. The irregular plot of the Ivins building caused it to have 24 corners with 2 diagonal wings pointed south, which enclosed light courts. That was the way late 19th century buildings allowed light and air into each office. In 1999, the Ivins building became a landmark, and in 2002, it became a mixed-use building with over 1,000 replacement windows installed. The first 10 floors are commercial office space. This is the old post office building across Park Row. This was the building that we saw in that triangle of land below City Hall. It was completed in the 1870s. It housed the federal courts as well as the Law Institute Library. This is the front of the building, and we're going to look at the back of the building in a moment and see why the federal judges thought this was such an unpleasant place. Here is a picture of Mayle Street around 1900. We see horses, dozens of horses, making noises that added to the usual urban din. They had their own distinctive odor that contributed to the city's own aroma. When the only summer ventilation was an open window, I'm sure we could understand the judge's dismay. Here is a photograph of Park Row taken 30 years later. You can see Mayle Street over here in the lower right-hand corner. Delivery trucks have replaced those horses and are now picking up and delivering the mail. A different sound and a different exhaust. Across Broadway from the post office was Astor House. Built in the 1840s, it was one of the most elegant hotels in America. By 1910, it had slipped. At the end of the block, to the west, down Vesey, was the Underwood building. In this photograph, we do not see the Woolworth building, so that places the picture sometime between 1910 and 1912, when the Woolworth building was completed. The present quarters of Nykla are located approximately here. This view of Astor House is from 1913. Notice that the Woolworth building has been completed. If you look closely, you can see the signs in the windows of the shops along the street announcing that they were going out of business. This panoramic view from 1906 captures a 180-degree field of view from Fulton to Vesey to Park Row, and with this picture we leave the intersection of Vesey, Park Row, and Broadway. This picture was taken west of Church Street, and it looks up Vesey Street toward the Evans Building. Here is the track of the 6th Avenue elevated at Church and Vesey. This shot was taken sometime before 1908 because we do not see the Underwood Building or the Garrison Building here. We're looking at the corner of Vesey and Church Street from the southwest. This picture shows the Underwood Building at the corner of Vesey and Church Street. Nicholas' founder, Charles Strauss, was a director and a member of the executive committee of the Underwood Corporation, the world's largest manufacturer of typewriters. Nicholas' first typewriter was an Underwood. The top of the Underwood Building has a large sign which remains visible to the east from the corner of William and Ann Street, approximately a quarter of a mile. To the east of the Underwood Building is number 20 Vesey Street, another landmark building designed by Robert Cohn and built in 1906. This is the Garrison Building, or the old New York Evening Post building owned by Oswald Garrison Villard. This building has a Rushmore connection to the county lawyers. As readers of Brethren and Sisters of the Bar have learned, one of the county lawyers' first directors and founders was Charles Rushmore, the namesake of Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. Indeed, Rushmore himself was the largest single individual contributor to the project of sculpting the 4 American presidents in massive relief. Now, the sculptor of Mount Rushmore was Gutzon Borglum, and Borglum was one of the 2 sculptors who rendered the 4 elongated figures on the front of the Garrison Building. The other sculptor was Estelle Kohn, the architect's wife. 9 stories above Vesey Street, these statues depict the 4 stages of publishing. On the far right is a bald man in flowing robes who represents the transmission of information by the spoken word. Next to him is a fellow wearing a cap and holding a large book in his right arm. It is a medieval manuscript and represents the transmission of information by written word. On the far left is a man with long hair and a flowing robe. He holds a single page in his left hand and rests his right hand on a column representing a screw from an early printing press. Next to him is a modern-looking fellow with a long topcoat and sleeves. He holds a quill pen in his right hand and an inkwell in the other. He represents the newspaper. The cast-iron spandrels of this building are decorated with the colophons of well-known 16th and 17th century printers. For example, this was the colophon of Jacobus de Frankfortium, and this was the well-known dolphin and anchor colophon used by Aldus Manutius, a student of Gutenberg. Now let's look at some other places from the beginning years. At the turn of the last century, Park Row, northeast of the Evans Building, had the nickname Newspaper Row. from left to right or north to south. There are the headquarters of the Tribune, the World, the Times, and the Potter Building. In 1904, the Times moved uptown to what was then called Longacre Square at Broadway and 42nd Street. Publisher Adolph Ochs persuaded Major McClellan to change the name to Times Square. Just south of Newspaper Row was the American Tract Society building at 150 Nassau. It was one of the 3 buildings that Nikola considered for its quarters in 1908. The Tract building is still standing at the corner of Spruce and Nassau Street. Its tower displays 4 caryatids that look like the figurehead of a clipper ship. Today, these ladies from the past look odd because they are literally strapped or lashed to the building itself. The Times building at 41 Park Row still stands. Pace University occupies it. Below street level, an open space once housed 5 printing presses that could churn out more than 12,000 newspapers an hour. Pace used the space as a gymnasium. The Potter Building is that distinctive red building that stands at the corner of Beekman and Park Row. It was one of the first fireproof buildings in Manhattan, made of terracotta on a steel frame. The Starbucks coffee shop across from J&R is on its ground floor. The other building where Nikola considered renting in 1908 was the Brill Building at Chambers Street and Broadway. A century ago, there was only one subway track that stretched downtown. From Grand Central Station south, it used the track that we now call the Lexington Avenue line, where the modern 4, 5, and 6 trains run north and south. 4 elevated train lines served Lower Manhattan. This map shows the 2 West Side lines, 6th Avenue and the 9th Avenue lines that ran along Church and Greenwich Streets. To the east, the 2nd Avenue and 3rd Avenue elevated lines connected uptown with Lower Manhattan. The 2nd Avenue L ran to Chatham Square. It was discontinued in 1942 when the 2nd Avenue subway was planned to replace it. 70 years later, that underground project remains a work in progress that will not serve its first passenger until at least 2014. Here is an image of the 3rd Avenue L at 65th Street uptown. Here is the 3rd Avenue L approaching the interchange at Chatham Square in the late 1930s. Here is the train just south of Chatham Square. The new federal courthouse looms to the right. The 3rd Avenue elevated line operated between South Ferry and Uptown until 1950, when it was phased out in Manhattan. Here's an image of the 3rd Avenue L as its shadows darkened Hanover Square during the 1930s. Just south of Hanover Square, the L's track made a sharp turn from Pearl Street east for 2 blocks to Front Street, and then sharply turned south to the ferry station. The 2 West Side elevated lines merged at Morris Street and then continued to Battery Place and South Ferry. Here's the junction as we look north along Greenwich Street from Battery Place. And here is a view of the junction looking south. It is difficult for a modern visitor to imagine the shadows